Can a phone threaten national security? According to the United Arab Emirates, it can if it's a BlackBerry. So they've banned the device. Are their concerns justified, or is this just another move to restrict personal freedoms? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Taimur Nabili. Now, the United Arab Emirates has said it will suspend the BlackBerry's Messenger, email and web browser services from October because of security concerns. They say while their decision is final, they're still discussing with the Canadian BlackBerry manufacturer Research in Motion, known as RIM. Now, the UAE's Telecommunications Regulatory Authority, or the TRA, says its concerns stem from not being able to monitor BlackBerry data. Now, typically a phone accesses information via a local network provider within the country, and this allows the regulatory bodies to control or monitor the data if they choose to. But BlackBerry allows its users to access the internet, email and send instant messages to other BlackBerry users through RIM's own secure network. That uses specialist encryption, and it's based offshore, meaning it bypasses the local provider and the local government, and that's where the concerns arise. The authorities in the UAE insist the move has nothing to do with censorship, but say that the decision is based on the fact that in their current form, certain BlackBerry services allow users to act without any legal accountability, causing judicial, social and national security concerns for the UAE. Well, the UAE is not the only country concerned about the security of the BlackBerry. Saudi Arabia has ordered local telecom to freeze the Messenger feature this month. Bahrain has instructed BlackBerry should not be used to distribute local news, and even France has ordered its officials not to use the services to avoid US intelligence from intercepting their sensitive information. And India has expressed serious concerns that BlackBerry's encryption could be used by terrorists. But a deal, the details of which have not been made available to the public, has been made between BlackBerry and Indian authorities. Well, joining me on the show today to discuss this issue are, in Dubai, Thomas Shambler, editor of Stuff magazine Middle East; in London, Nigel Stanley, a specialist in business, technology and IT security at Bloor Research; and also in London, Ian Brown is a senior fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute. Gentlemen, thank you all for joining us today. And let's begin in Dubai, if we could. The attention-grabbing headline is the UAE is banning the device. But what's really behind this particular story?
Well, we're not totally sure. We know as much as everyone else does. The TRA made a statement last week saying they were looking into possible solutions for BlackBerry breaking these rules. And we found out yesterday that Etisalat and Du, two of the biggest telecom providers in the region, would be stopping service on October the 11th. So all we know right now is that on the October the 11th, everything's going to stop for BlackBerry.
And practically speaking, though, I mean, there is, at least on paper, a reasonable argument to be made on the behalf of the government, right? They don't have access and they don't have control over matters that could pertain to their national security.
That's what they tell us, yes. And I think a lot of BlackBerry users would believe them, except last year, a lot of people remember last year that Etisalat actually sent out a text message to a lot of its users. That text message actually led users to download spyware, which was sending emails and private info to private servers within the UAE.
All right. Well, I mean, the issue of whether and how they go about monitoring data is a completely different one. But just from a purely technical perspective, let's move it to London for a minute. And Nigel Stanley, let me ask your opinion on this. The fact is that the Dubai government, the UAE governments, don't have any ability to keep tabs on what is going through the system in their country. And that, in a way, is a legitimate security concern for them, isn't it?
Well, it's a good point, but you need to separate the technical requirements and the political requirements. And I think you'll find that most governments want the ability to see what their citizens are up to. And I think the issue isn't necessarily technical, it's how can they look after the citizens' welfare, but in a free and open society in a way that doesn't compromise users' security and their own personal privacy. So I think that's the problem that people are trying to contend with here.
But, I mean, the issue still remains that the way it's being framed in the press right now is this is a matter for censorship. Let me put it to you, Ian Brown. It's not really a matter for censorship at all, because every government in the world where BlackBerries are in use have technically, theoretically, the ability to access that data. The UAE doesn't. So why should they be different?
Well, it seems that a number of large countries, particularly China and India, have been able to persuade Research in Motion, the Canadian company that makes BlackBerry, to essentially give those countries the full ability to look at traffic flowing through their BlackBerry networks, whereas smaller countries such as UAE, it seems they're not willing to give that capability to.
And therefore, the point that I'm trying to establish here, basically, just as a starting point, is that the UAE isn't actually prima facie doing anything with this particular request that every other country in the world hasn't at least expressed an interest, a desire, or an ability to do.
There are certainly a lot of other countries all around the world, including the US and the UK, where governments have said that they also want this kind of interception capability.
All right, well, having said all of that, then let's move on to the next point, which is essentially there is more to it than that, isn't there? Because even if, let's take, for example, Research in Motion decides to place some servers within the UAE and allow the government there the kind of access they require, it doesn't really answer some of the concerns, does it, Nigel Stanley?
Well, it doesn't, because at the end of the day, if the government wants to look at the data, then they will do as you say. They will negotiate a deal and move the servers back to within UAE and monitor the servers there. I think the issue is that people are generally concerned about the appropriate protocols around accessing the data, such that, well, if my data is there, how can I be assured that it won't be open to other snooping beyond cybercrime and counter-terrorism issues and the type of issues that we accept that the governments may wish to look at my data for?
Is there any way that citizens in any country in the world can ever feel confident about those issues?
Well, ultimately not. But I mean, if you look at the UK, there are various safeguards in place. There's judiciary overview. There's RIPA Part 3, so there's various laws and legislation that put in place various processes before data can be accessed and people ask for their encryption keys. I think the concern that people have is how secure is my data going to be within the UAE, and are there equivalent safeguards such that when I'm travelling to the UAE, my data will be secure?
And Thomas, it's kind of partly related to the point that you made earlier on. Last year, the local telecoms company actually lied to the population and installed spyware under the guise of helping them get better service, didn't they?
Yes, that's true. But I think a lot of the consumers out here, we are aware that, for lack of a better word, we're being snooped on. It's part of the reason, well, we're here, we must accept it. And I don't think many consumers are necessarily worried about that. At the end of the day, they own a BlackBerry, which costs upwards of $500 US. They pay $50 US every month for the right to use their data, their messages, their emails. And we've all just been told, myself included, I'm a BlackBerry user, that come October 11th, all that will be suspended.
Well, you say that most people just accept that. I'd like you to expand on that a little bit, because the perception, I think, overseas from where you are is probably much harsher than that. I mean, the consequences of being found to transgress one of the UAE's laws is probably a little bit more severe than the consequences of transgressing a UK law, isn't it?
I agree, but in our daily life, our internet, for example, certain websites that go against the moral, social, lawful codes of the UAE, these are blocked. These are kind of widely accepted. It's almost similar to kind of Pakistan blocked Facebook. That's the reality there. And the same with Google in China. It's just one of the things which we can't do very much about, so we go through it.
Ian, you brought up the issue of China and the fact that there seemed to have been some kind of deal done there. The Google issue is another one. I mean, the whole moral dimension of not just the BlackBerry issue, but the Google issue and local politics is so complex. Is there any way we can even begin to tackle this? Where should we start?
I think it's very difficult for large multinational companies like Google, who understandably see very large markets in countries such as China. They don't want their services to be blocked. At the same time, they are wary of upsetting their customers, perhaps in the West, who want to hold them to a higher standard. So I agree this causes great difficulties for them.
But at the end of the day, we're sitting here talking about an issue that many governments would actually feel some sympathy with. Is there any real reason why we should even talk about this? Because the potential for reconciling one single standard worldwide is almost entirely impossible, isn't it?
It's certainly difficult to set global standards on this. At the same time, I think it's one thing to say that large companies like Research in Motion have to help governments in democratic countries where there are independent judicial oversight of this kind of interception. I think it's another thing for those companies to start supplying spying technology to governments in countries such as China, where there are not all of those human rights protections for their citizens.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and we'll come on to that in just a second. Let me first ask you, though, Nigel, about the other element of this that the government in the UAE has brought up, and that is the potential for damage to national security. Let's just ask you, how likely is it that the use of a cell phone can genuinely be a threat to national security? And not only, I'm not asking you, can there be instances where national security is damaged, but is it a long-term serious threat that could undermine an entire structure?
I think it is, but if you look at crime and terrorism over the years, it's always happened. What we're seeing with mobile phone technology, with email technology, is just a different way of maybe coordinating attacks and actually executing attacks. So the mobile phone per se is a great liberator, but ultimately it can be used by bad people to do bad things.
Yes,
so,
of course, and there's
yes,
no denying that.
Problem.
But here's my question. I mean, I remember that about 10 years ago, probably even more, Louis Freeh, the former CIA director in the US, testified before Congress when there was a big debate at the time over the whole point of encryption. Encryption technology itself was becoming much more sophisticated, and the US government was deeply worried about the ability, as Louis Freeh put it, of drug runners and terrorists being able to communicate without government scrutiny. He made a big fuss about it, and yet encryption has come online. A lot of people use it, and we haven't seen the US government come under serious threat from drug runners and terrorists.
Yeah, I mean, obviously encryption's a technology that's been around for many years now, and you can easily obtain encryption free of charge off the internet. The interesting thing is why so many of the bad guys aren't actually using it, which is quite interesting, but we don't want them to use it anyway. But yeah, I mean, obviously encryption's out there and people are using it, but it's not turned into the big demon. And I think likewise with cell phones and mobile phones, they're not the enemy. It's basically we need the oversight, the controls of that don't step too far and basically don't overwrite the majority of people's liberties and abilities to conduct their business in their daily life without massive constraints and concerns that they're going to be spied on.
Ian, let me put the same question to you. I mean, we have seen within the UAE recently the assassination of a Hamas leader. They, it seems, did use encrypted telephones to communicate. But should we not be regarding incidents like this as outliers and saying to governments, look, these things, disasters, outliers will happen irrespective of what you do. You can't take a sledgehammer to crack a nut.
I think that's right. I think governments have to be very careful not to over-demonize new technologies such as these. There are other ways of investigating these kind of plots. You can, of course, intelligence agencies have human sources within terrorist groups. They can try to plant bugs in the places where those groups are planning. So the availability of encryption doesn't make it impossible to investigate this kind of thing. I think we also have to be aware that yes, the UAE is trying to block BlackBerry services here, but there are all sorts of other ways that people planning criminal activities can communicate with a whole range of services on the internet using encryption, which will be very difficult for governments to block in future.
Thomas, in Dubai, I mean, this is obviously a problem that is a regular one in places like the UAE, isn't it? Because with every new development in technology and every new advance in the ability of people to communicate, governments like the UAE are fighting almost a losing battle. Do you get a sense that the government is feeling under pressure from this stuff over there?
In a way they do, but I mean, more recently than this, Google's Android operating system, it's a fantastic system, has taken the world by storm, and one of the reasons why it's been so popular is its Android market. The Android market is similar to the iTunes application store. This has been banned in the UAE since the first mobiles came here almost 6 months ago. We're no stranger to this sort of, call it censorship, call it hand-holding by the government.
But at the end of the day, people there, as people everywhere in the world, working their way around this stuff.
It is, in a way, kind of certainly the comments that I've heard myself. People aren't so much angry about, let's say, the UAE possibly looking at our private data. They are more worried about how they're going to send emails, how they're going to, private message people, how they're going to stay in touch with work when they're out and about. Those are the issues that I think a vast majority of the consumers out here are actually worried about, which is why Etisalat and Do have both said that they are exploring alternatives to a BlackBerry system.
Ian, in London, the governments, as in the UAE, many governments around the world, and you mentioned China earlier on, are concerned about the potential for the undermining of systems that are so closed by this kind of technology. And you can't go to a single democracy conference anywhere in the world without people trying to push for the use of these things for that very purpose. Who's likely to win in this? I mean, can governments keep a lid on this kind of technology, or are they right to be afraid?
I think it's very difficult for governments to win in the long term against these technologies. If you look at China, which puts an enormous amount of money into policing the internet, into filtering it, into having tens of thousands of dedicated police officers monitoring what their users are doing in China, there is still all sorts of information and news that's spread within China by activists that the Chinese government hasn't been able to stop. And most governments just don't have those kind of resources or the political will to do that. So I think ultimately states like the UAE are on a losing battle here.
Nigel, it's not just, I want to bring up again the reality that however much we may think that Western governments are more reliable and less extreme, the fact is that the legislation in the US that was introduced post 9/11 gives the US government unprecedented and almost unlimited access to our personal data, not just US citizens. I mean, people like you and I are probably crossing their radar every day as well, aren't we?
We are, and I think that some people's attitude is, well, nothing to hide, nothing to fear. But the reality is that if a government of whatever guise wanted to get to your data and understand what you're talking about on your mobile phone, then they will do. And the draconian powers that we are seeing give enormous ability, plus the enormous intelligence services that you're now seeing across a number of government bodies, the ability to tap into those messages and to find out what people are talking about. I think the key thing is that the sheer volume of this data is ultimately going to be the limiting factor, because there's so much of it around. The government agencies can't possibly track everything. Therefore, they're going to have to be more selective and hopefully just focus on the bad guys and the people that really should be monitored.
All right, let's get back to the issue in Dubai then. And Thomas, I'll ask you, is there a potential to solve this particular dispute, even though what we're talking about in Dubai right now is just a particular and very singular application? Do you think they're going to sort this out with RIM, or does the UAE not have the power to move a corporation that big?
Well, I think India has been trying to get this similar sort of local servers from RIM for the past 2 years. And I think the BlackBerry makers have told them that they don't want to go down that path, sorry. So for the UAE, yes, it's quite a large market. There's approximately 500,000 BlackBerry users that are native here. But in the global scale and in the Gulf scale, I think we're quite a small market.
But at the end of the day, the market there is one that supports a number of businesses too. Surely they're damaging their internal business market if they rule out. I think there are 500,000 users there, aren't there?
Well, the TRA has said, it's given us kind of two answers, really. It's already said that this decision is final, but it's also said that it is still talking to RIM, and they're hoping to come up with a solution. Both Etisalat and Do, the telecoms providers, they're obviously saying a similar sort of thing, pushing onto the TRA, saying a solution hopefully will be met, but if not, then you can use this service, you can use this mobile, you can use this plan. So right now, we don't know. Personally, I think we may be looking at no BlackBerries come October 12th.
Ian, one interesting aspect of this is this face-off between a corporation and a government. I mean, a lot of the conversation we've been having has been about individual rights, but actually what this has thrown up is the reality that companies like BlackBerry have an enormous amount of power. Is that a concern?
Well, so far, from a human rights perspective, I think companies like RIM, companies like Google have largely used that power for the good, to support privacy and freedom of expression of their users. You're quite right that won't necessarily always be the case, and I think that's something that human rights campaigners all over the world need to keep an eye on and to keep up pressure on large global companies to use that power responsibly.
Nigel, you talked about the sheer volume of information that's being generated and the sheer rapidity of the advancement of this kind of technology. Advancing that as a potential to suggest that maybe it's the technology and the individual that are going to win over repressive governments. Are you really so sure that that's going to be the case? Are you willing to bet against the possibility that, as we've seen Nokia doing in Iran, that there will be corporations who are willing to help repressive governments, and there is technology out there that is good enough to suppress as much as governments want to suppress?
Well, when you come into battles of technology versus governments, obviously you are going to find some corporate entities that are happy to chase the dollar and actually provide services to what some people may consider to be a repressive government. At the end of the day, it's up to that corporate organisation, their shareholders and their consciences to decide whether that's something they want to do. But ultimately, we are going to be in a technological arms race as more and more technology comes down the line. Governments are going to be struggling, governments across the world are going to be struggling to keep up the technology and ways of tracking what people are doing, the good guys and the bad guys.
Thomas, do you see the UAE government struggling to keep up?
Well, on a technical standpoint, yes, I do. Dubai tries to put itself out there, the whole UAE actually, as the trade and tourism hub of the Middle East. It likes to build the biggest buildings, the longest roads, the best metros. Yet, on a technical view, we only had Facebook unblocked a few years ago. We have this whole BlackBerry thing now, Google Android, website censorship. I'm not sure if they really align in Dubai becoming the best that it can be and the best city, country in the Gulf.
And just a final word from our London guest then. Let's start with you, Nigel. Is this issue, or one like it, going to cause democratic change or indeed any other kind of change in countries like the UAE or perhaps even China?
Well, it would be good to think that this is a catalyst for democratic change. Whether it does or not, I guess, is open to debate. I think the interesting thing is that it spurns conversations such as this, where people are sitting around and talking about this and saying, OK, well, let's discuss the issues. So hopefully, if nothing else, is actually giving people an opportunity to talk about democratic issues.
Ian, a final word from you on this issue. Any change in the offing?
Well, I think Nigel's right. I think it stimulates conversation, and I'm glad that RAM in this case is standing up for its users' privacy, and I think in the end it is RAM and countries and companies like that that will have the upper hand in this debate.
And gentlemen, there we will have to leave it. I'd like to thank you all for joining us on the show today. We had Thomas Shambler in Dubai, Nigel Stanley in London, and also in London, Ian Brown joining us on the programme. And thank you so much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your questions, comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.